Okay, and back. Yes, so this is part 2 of the time to talk sharing for today. Talking some more about mental health. In part 1, I covered a bit about what mental health actually is. I talked about nutrition and diet for mental health, and analyzing a little bit what choices we have available to us when it comes to what we allow into our minds, talking particularly about news and information. And started to talk a little bit about anxiety, sharing about self-awareness and neurological conditions and what impact they could have on the experience of anxiety. And now I'd like to talk about our belief systems and what impact they could have also on our experience of anxiety. So I thought it would be useful actually before that to perhaps talk a little bit about what anxiety actually is. So in increasing levels of severity, perhaps, so we're thinking, we are forecasting, we are assuming certain events will happen, we are concerned that certain negative events will happen, we are worried that certain negative events will happen, we are anxious about things happening, and then all the way over to terrified, debilitated, and stunned. So anxiety can have different levels of severity, of course, but generally it is a sensation in us that helps us be that not helps us, that brings us to be a much lesser version of ourselves. Certainly speaking from own experience. So I know that we all have an immense potential as human beings, and anxiety can severely limit our ability to embrace our potential, of course. And as I said, we can experience different levels of anxiety. Even the mildest level of anxiety has a negative impact. And in this narrative, it is worth considering that the original source of anxiety was actually trying to help us, right? It was trying to help us back in the old days, before we had such concentrated civilization, living in urban areas, when we were out there in the wild and were faced with true threats to our livelihoods, true threats to our existence and our physical well-being. Right, we look out to the periphery, and we see some rustling in the grass, and without any prior experience, it's just rustling in the grass. But at one point, that rustling in the grass might actually be a predator, say a lion or a bear, but it doesn't really matter. And that lion looks at us and thinks, "Oh, that looks tasty." And we are seeing it rustling in grass. We're identifying it as a tiger, and that's the tiger starting. Stick with the same animal, George. Which one shall I pick now? Let's stick with the tiger. So the tiger comes out charging at us and tries to run us down, and is of course threatening our life. So we manage to escape, and we go back to our lives. Some days later, we are in a similar spot. We see a similar scenery. We see and hear something rustling in the grass, and we think, "Oh, that's probably the tiger again, right?" And we're getting fearful, which can be a good response because it helps to then put the body into an overactive mode where we have a lot more blood pumping to the center of our body, give our heart more oxygen, give our muscles more oxygen, but actually depriving the oxygen that is available to the brain, but making us ready to fight or flee, and hopefully not necessarily freeze. Well, in some situations that might be a useful threat response. Anyway, but fact of the matter is that we're looking at their rustling, and we're worrying, and we're anxious that there might be another tiger there in the grass. And this time it isn't. But because our previous experience with the tiger has been so traumatic, this is a much stronger memory for us than the original experience where the rustling was just the wind, right? So we are bound to expect a tiger coming out of the grass whenever we see the rustling. And our body's response to that is to get ready to deal with it somehow. So in a way, and the more that happens, the stronger the pattern gets, right? And that is one way of looking at anxiety. It's a mental pattern that has created itself for fear of something bad happening to us that isn't actually happening to us. And through growing our self-awareness, we can actually develop more resilience on that. So as we actually take a moment to connect with our anxiety, which is counterintuitive, because believe me, we don't really want to go there, right? It's not a sensation that we embrace, that we want to have. However, if we turn towards it for a moment and try and come to an understanding of the source of the anxiety, and confront the anxiety and see, okay, anxiety, you're there. Where are you coming from? What are you trying to protect me from? Then we can increase our self-awareness, and we can put ourselves into a position to grow more resilience to the situation that makes us anxious. I'm not intending to trivialize this. So if you are a person who is working through anxiety and is aware of certain amounts of anxiety in your life, I don't presume to understand where that is coming from. My point is merely that running away from it is only helping us so much. And I am very determined to continue to learn about myself and continue to learn about what is in the way of my mental health and what I need to nurture my mental health. So when we are in a position where we are experiencing anxiety, I attempt to practice, and it does require practice. It is not something that we simply choose to do from one day to another and we've mastered, right? Growing self-awareness requires deliberate practice. So even with anxiety, turning towards it and trying to understand where do you come from, anxiety? What are you trying to protect me from? And how real of a threat is that actually? Is a technique that has certainly helped me more and more. And I'm still working on it, but it is definitely helping. And I would say, of course, this type of technique is more readily available to us if we are, if the level of anxiety is lower. If there are severe anxieties that are debilitating to a person, then of course you would want to seek professional help and might needs to work with some cognitive behavioral therapy and or I wouldn't say or, and couple that perhaps if it's truly severe, also with medication to bring the initial level of anxiety down to a level where you are more able to tap into everything that you have available to yourself as an adult, and work with it this way. There is a book where I learned quite a fair bit about obsessive compulsive disorders, which are obviously correlated with anxiety if the compulsion is not fulfilled, where through functional MRI scans, the scientists were able to actually detect what is going on in the brain of a person who is dealing with obsessive compulsive disorder. And something that I actually, so I'm glad I remembered talking about OCD. Something that I really, really also wanted to ensure that we cover is in popular media, if you will, there is a fair amount of conversation using terms like perfectionism and OCD almost for bragging rights. But people who are dealing with clinical perfectionism, as I like to call it, I'm one of those, or people who are actually dealing with obsessive compulsive disorders, I'm sorry, it's just wrong. We cannot use such terms lightly, because somebody who's actually dealing with an obsessive compulsive disorder is in a very, very different place to someone who just likes things neat. Yeah. If I have two pens on my desk and they are aligned like this, it looks neat and tidy to me, and that's nice, right? If they look like that, it doesn't look as neat and tidy, but I am very much able to live with that, right? But a person with obsessive compulsive disorder, they will have their specific type of obsessive compulsive of obsessive compulsion, and it could be that everything has to be parallel, right? And if it's not a right angle, it's a wrong angle, for example. So that either has to be parallel or perfectly perpendicular, but probably with two pens here parallel. But for a person who's living with OCD and tries to work through that, they don't feel like they have a choice, and it takes a fair amount of work to help them understand that they do have a choice, and it is a self-reinforcing feedback loop in their brain that we can actually see through a functional MRI scan, where that comes through in the brain. When a loop is opened, there is so much concentration of blood flow to that area in the brain that shows that in order for this, it's like a computer going into overdrive, right? For this to stop, the person has to close the loop. And that's very different from somebody who likes to have their affairs in order and just has a strong professional standard, right? But actually, it doesn't have any physiological signs that it is a physiological conditioning that is the case. This is that simply a professional standard. So I would encourage us all to be very mindful of the language that we use, and be mindful of clinical labels or medical labels like obsessive compulsive disorder, and not take that out of context, because I think it takes something away from our appreciation of helping people who are actually living and trying to work evolve beyond things like OCD. Okay, so anxieties, yes, and actually, as I said, I wanted to talk about also belief systems and how they are involved with anxieties. So if as a working appreciation, let's just say that one of the impacts of anxiety is that they don't allow us to be the best version of ourselves that we can be. And another source of an anxiety is our belief systems. So we have grown up, and through growing up, through that experience, we have formed a certain belief system, which is a set of filters, if you will, that every piece of information that goes into our mind is being processed through. And there is an event outside, it gets processed through all these filters, through our belief systems, and then as a reaction to that, there is a certain experience happening inside of us, right? So we can see an event, and based on that event, passes through all our filters, through our belief systems, and we have an emotion in response to that, right? And so these belief systems manifest themselves in so many different ways. It's the way that our brain has set itself up to furnish our experience of reality. And through our brain, we are then in a position where we have a certain reaction to an event outside. So when it comes to anxiety, this set of filters and beliefs is then a certain conditioning. So for example, let's use perception of time, punctuality, to be more specific. So I seek to be on time as much as I can control and influence. And I detect from my own experience that when I'm doing the best to be on time, but something happens and I eat through a useful amount of buffer that I have planned into my journey, that buffer gets used up. And all of a sudden, I'm redlining, if you will, and it is likely that I'm running late. Okay, so what then happens for me, right? There is an event, there is a certain set of facts. I am not late yet, but it is, in my perception, incredibly likely that I will end up being late to an appointment. And I have a very high, I place a very high value on being on time. So my belief system then kicks in and says, well, if I'm not on time, I'm gonna disappoint the other person, I'm disrespecting the other person, but I'm basically projecting my belief system onto the other person. If I'm meeting someone who has a very different belief system when it comes to time, and that belief system has a lot of cultural background as well, right? We associate different levels of punctuality with different cultural backgrounds as well, and different appreciations of timeliness. But what's happening in that moment is that my belief system overrules me and basically then throws up all these potentialities, these possible negative outcomes that then have an impact on my valuation of myself as a person and my standing in society or in the social group. And the emotional reaction to that is anxiety. Right. So because I have spent a fair amount of time improving that, I am now at a stage where I only leave a reasonable amount of buffer that I plan into my journey. When this pattern of punctuality got out of hand for me, I had a huge amount of buffer just in case, right? This just in case happened maybe 1 out of 100 times. It's probably exaggerated, but just making the point. And then I gained more self-awareness around it and looked at the numbers and said, well, actually, what I'm doing is I'm diminishing the quality of my life by stressing about this and giving into this anxiety by putting in so much buffer, which doesn't really work. So through increasing my self-awareness about this, I was able to shorten the buffer. But what else is happening here, right? It's this belief system of mine, this anxiety around what it will mean to my relationship with the other person, what it will mean to how the other person sees me, and by extension then on my worth as a person in that societal construct. So well, what to do about this, right? So a few things that I tried out. First of all, I actually like to have a conversation now with people, certainly in a professional, in the business context, and talk a little bit about punctuality. That that's one of the things that are important to me. And for a period of time, I was disappointed very much when other people were late. And that in itself is a blanket statement, right? Because what seems late to me, someone who values punctuality very highly, is not being perceived as being late by another person who doesn't have this belief system in their modus operandi. And so we talk about what is late, right? And I actually I'm just remembering I have a very specific agreement with one of my coachees, and we said, so I will be there on time to start our coaching meeting at the agreed time, because that's the agreed start time. That's how I see it, right? The coachee said, okay, well, they're aiming to be there no more than 5 minutes after that, and that to them it would be on time. To them, being late would mean 10 minutes after, right? So that basically means if the person is not there 10 minutes after, then they are a no-show for that coaching meeting, right? And this way, it's very clear and easy, right? So I still believe that punctuality is a valuable trait. It's something that literally everybody can do. It doesn't require any particular skill. It simply requires paying attention to your time and putting in reminders and allowing for enough travel time, for example. But everybody can do it, right? But it's important to me. It's not as important to others as it is to me. And by level setting on expectations on these types of things, we can remove sources of anxiety, right? And when it comes to then my being late, it really doesn't happen very often. Now I send a message saying, well, I've used up my travel buffer. I don't exactly know whether I am going to be late. There is a possibility that I'm going to be late. I will be there as soon as the transport options allow me to. Apologies, and I'll see you soon. Right. So what I have, through increasing self-awareness and through practice, what I have come to doing is to actually take the power away from the anxiety by taking a small action. And the small action is to just let the other person know. And if you're watching this and listening to this and you're thinking, well, I mean, that's just common sense, right? You just send the other person a message if you're running late. Well, it might not seem like a big deal to you if this comes natural to you, but for me, I don't have a lot of experience being late. Yeah. So if being on time was the definition of success, I don't have a lot of experience with failure. in that context, right? Because it was very important to me to always be on time, because in my mind, um, the objective, well, if you have a meeting that starts at a certain time, you make sure that you're there at a certain time. That's just it, right? And when you're almost never late, you don't have any experience in what it's like to deal with that, right? So for me, that was an area where I had to practice that. So in those few cases where I was starting to redline, the anxiety would grew, and if you don't have that belief system, you don't have that source of anxiety, and if you don't have the belief system, you don't have that source of anxiety. So I'm just checking my notes. Was there anything else I wanted to say on this one? Okay. Yes. So so how to deal with it through actually growing a self-awareness. What is the source of the anxiety? Dear anxiety, turning into it. What are you actually trying to help protect me from taking action in order to take the power away from the anxiety? And that would help. Okay. Okay. Then what's next? Yeah. Okay. I think I'm going to change the order here. Yeah. So self-awareness, I think, is a very big topic that goes throughout mental health growth and mental health development. It's an ongoing journey, I think, for us as human beings. The more we practice it, the more we discover. But if we don't spend any time on growing our self-awareness, it's even we're essentially ignorant to why we're behaving in the way that we're behaving, because our behavior is the result of our mind's way of processing reality, our perception of reality, feeding it through all the filters, feeding it through our belief systems, and ultimately coming up with a reaction. And what the power of self-awareness is, and there are so many terms for it now, right? So, self-awareness is a big subject, but it's sometimes conflated together with mindfulness and so on and so forth. Self-awareness is for me very, very simply becoming more aware and conscious about what is going on for ourselves, inside ourselves, how we are reacting to everything. And for me, the power of growing self-awareness is that we can move from reacting to things over to responding to things, right? A reaction is something that is instinctual. A reaction is something that is unconscious. A reaction is something that simply happens based on whatever is the most efficient mental pathway that has developed over time in our minds, right? And that is reacting and just going through life without question. And our opportunity, and I believe our obligation actually as human beings, is that we leverage what evolution has equipped us with, which is the full capacity of our mind, of our brain. So growing self-awareness over time is I think where all else comes from, right? Because if we grow our self-awareness, we will probably grow a desire to improve our mental well-being. We probably grow our desire to be a better human being in our interactions with other people, but also with ourselves, to appreciate more what it is that we can do to make a difference in our lives, and so on and so forth. So the journey of growing self-awareness is in a way to increase the space and set of options that we have between an event and our response to it. And there is a good correlation also to emotional management, if you will, where we have the ABC of emotions, right? There's the A, the activating event. There's the B, the belief system that the event is processed through. And then the C is, I forgot now what the C stands for. C is essentially our reaction or response to it. Happens to me that I sometimes forget that. Anyway, yeah, the C is then what we do in reaction or response to it, right? So if we have no self-awareness and we're acting basically simply on impulse, then there is very little space and time in between the A and the C, and the B happens completely unconsciously and is marginalized. It's still in there, but we can't quite see it, right? And in some cases, that's very helpful, right? So, for example, a self-protecting impulse is nerve endings in the finger. We touch something that's hot, and we don't need to think about it. Our central nervous system processes, this is too hot. We need to remove the hand from danger, lest we damage our skin, right? That's great. We want that. Yeah. But when it comes to interaction with certain situations, it usually serves as well to be more aware of all the options that we have available when it comes to a response. So widening the space between the A and the C is what we would want in order to grow our self-awareness, because if the A happens all the time. There's always a situation around us that we have a choice in response to. And then between here is our now more aware and more conscious processing of what is going on, and our analysis of what beliefs we're filtering and analyzing this through, and so on and so forth, and our evaluation of our possible options. And then ultimately, we're choosing a response, and we're acting on that response. And that is a very logical way of looking at it, and it's also used in so many other disciplines like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And behavioral change, and so on and so forth is in there, where you have a trigger and you have a response, and everything that is going in between them. And sometimes that this three-stage approach is broken down more, and there are more steps in there. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact there is something happening outside of you. You're a human being, you're processing it, and you're doing something in response, right? If we have no self-awareness, we're just doing what we are more or less automatically doing. And when we are not giving ourselves the opportunity to find a better response to it, we're simply reacting, right? So let's widen this. Let's work out what's going on for ourselves, and so on and so forth, right? Good. So that's on self-awareness. And with that, we have yeah, and as I mentioned, this is also coming from growing your EI, your emotional intelligence, because there's a very common way of talking about emotions as well. We often say he or she made me feel bad, or this made me feel bad. In a world where there is a marginalized B, that is correct, right? Something happened and we felt bad. But in a world where we're appreciating that we can actually widen our interaction with the B in the middle, with the belief system that is happening, then we're understanding it is not the event that is making us feel a certain way, it's the meaning that we're associating with the event that we then have an emotion in reaction to. And then, so by looking at what is that meaning, we will grow our understanding of the reason for the emotional reaction to it. So turning this through a different lens, if you will, we, in order to make the statement true, he or she made me feel bad, it would literally mean that the person went into your brain, flipped a switch that activates an emotion. Did the person do that? No, right? So how come we're feeling a certain way? Well, a person did something, not necessarily even to us. A person did something. Their action was analyzed by us, right? But they had an intention, and the impact on us is removed from their intention. The impact on us is our perception of the action, processing that action through our belief system, and finding what we're making of that action. And then there is a reaction to it. Right? If that reaction is a negative emotion, that means that the action of the person we've associated a negative meaning with. So we need to be mindful of what the meaning is that we're associating with an event. And this is probably also then a good point to bring up things like cognitive biases, right? Growing self-awareness also means that we want to grow our understanding of our cognitive biases. And there are most of these are unconscious, and by growing our self-awareness, we want to make them more conscious, because then we have more influence over them. There is one bias that is particularly relevant to point out here, which is the confirmation bias. And the confirmation bias is a way of the brain to reinforce mental pathways, right? So we have formed a certain belief system, which means we have kind of formalized a pattern in our mind about how a certain sequence of event goes and what the meaning of them is, and so on and so forth, right? And it's and for the brain is a very, very lazy organism, right? Generally, the body is trying to be as energy efficient as possible, but when it comes to the brain, that's often not really helping us. But the brain is trying to always use the most efficient way of processing the input, right? So this ABC goes against the natural disposition of the brain, and that's why it takes practice in order to widen the B. But this confirmation bias is what the mind does when it tries to reinforce one of those patterns, right? So say and this when we can use this to our advantage, or we can let it happen to our disadvantage. So say, for example, I had a very positive experience with trying to pick something. Let's say I had a positive experience. Say I went on a holiday to a new country, and of course I can only meet so many people on my travels. Say I am in a new country for 1 week, and I have had nothing but positive experiences with the locals. Right. So based on what I've experienced, all the experiences with 100% of my experience with the locals have been positive. Right. So that means that my mind has built up an image of the locals there that is very positive. So then I'm meeting other people from that country. My mind goes into the database, looks up, we've met this type of people before, they've always been positive, so I'm looking for reinforcement data that I can take out of that interaction. So my mind will look for positive things in the interaction with the other people in order to reinforce the pattern, right? So it's a confirmation bias. We're always looking for confirmation of what we already believe. And the more evidence the mind accumulates, the stronger that pattern will get. And if that is a positive pattern, great. If that is a negative pattern, bad, of course, right? Because if we've had a negative experience with a certain group of people, then we will be predisposed to expect similar negativity from all people who belong to that social group. Yeah. And our brain will identify more conscious and will serve to our consciousness everything that confirms to that. So this confirmation bias is also very often seen in political campaigns, right, where political campaigns are emotionally driven, and this whole us versus them dynamic is abused in ethically substandard political campaigns in order to motivate the target audience, because that goes into emotional leverage. And these political campaigns then often work together with sowing filtered information to reinforce those mental patterns in order to drive a further wedge in between the us and the them, whatever that might be. So this confirmation bias is something that we must be aware of as we grow our self-awareness, because the patterns that we have now don't necessarily need to help, could get in the way of us actually achieving our goals. And the more we are aware of what the meaning is that we're associating with events and actions and social groups and everything, the more ability we have to change it, the more ability we have to change it for the better. And yes, okay, so self-awareness. I'm just thinking whether there's anything else that I wanted to share about self-awareness. On this, I think good for now. Okay, yeah, I think I'm okay for now. And so this is part 2. I will take a short break and then come back to part 3, where I'll talk about depression. So thanks for now.